Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's session. My name is Nick Pearce. I'm Professor of Public Policy at the University of Bath and Director of the Institute for Policy Research at the University. I help to convene a group involved in the Freiburg Institute of Basic Income Studies on microsimulation research. Microsimulation research into basic income proposals, basic income schemes, different variants of those that might be trialed, might be considered, and might help inform public debate in the UK, the EU, and more widely internationally. But we also at the Institute for Policy Research have a strong interest in the research into basic income experiments and pilots, the politics of those pilot schemes, those experiments, the substantive issues involved in setting them up, how they're funded, how they are implemented, developed, and the results that they achieve, and how those enable us to think about basic income and its potential, its feasibility in different welfare states and different national political contexts. And in that regard, I'm very pleased today to be able to welcome to speak to us in this session, Professor Ollie Kangas. Professor Kangas is the director of the Equal Society Research Program at the Academy of Social Research at the University of Turku in Finland, and was formerly director of government relations and head of the research department at the Social Insurance Institution of Finland, which is called Kela, and in that capacity was a central figure in establishing, implementing and evaluating the famous basic income experiment in Finland that took place in 2017-2018. It was announced by the incoming coalition government in 2015 in rather unusual circumstances, politically rather unusual, but gathered worldwide attention as a leading basic income pilot in the OECD countries, certainly, and therefore of considerable interest in public debate around the world. And the experiment and the many different aspects of it are examined in this recently published book, Experimenting with Unconditional Basic Income, which Professor Kangas has edited and published with his colleagues from Kela and from Finland on the lessons of the experiment. And that's what he's going to talk to us about today. And so we're going to hear from Professor Kangas about the Finland basic income experiment. Then we've got a chance to do some questions, have some Q&A to go through the session, to ask him any questions about the pilot after his presentation. So I am going to, I hope, be able now to hand over to Professor Kangas for his presentation. He's going to be able to share his screen with you. He's got a slide deck for his talk, so he's going to share his screen with you, and then I shall shut my video down and I'll mute myself and hand over to Ollie. So Ollie Kangas, over to you. Thanks. You're very welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. My pleasure to be here. And Nick, thank you very much for your nice words. My presentation is, as Nick said, about the Finnish basic income experiment. I will say something about the construction of the experiment and then tell a little bit about why the experiment was constructed in that way as it was constructed, and then say something about the results, and finally deliberate a little bit if basic income after the COVID pandemic is feasible in this country. As Nick said, context, the experiments are run in different countries, have a huge impact which kind of results we will get. And therefore, I will say something about the Finnish social security system that was the basis or the background where the basic income experiment was carried out in this country. The Finnish social security system is divided in two parts. The first part, it's based on residence, and there's a difference in comparison with some other welfare states, in that sense that the Finnish basic security system is based on residence, not on the citizenship as it's in some other countries. And there's a rather substantial number of different kind of basic security benefits, as we call them in Finland. For example, social assistance, national pensions, minimum sickness benefits, minimum unemployment benefits, etc., etc. And as I said, that they are based on residence, they are universal, and they cover all the population residing in the country. And in that sense, the step from the Finnish social security system to full partial basic income would not be that big a step if we would implement the basic income. And then on top of those basic benefits, we have employment-related benefits that usually are totally income-related without any ceilings, so that they are expressed as a percentage of previous salary or wage, and then the amounts are paid out totally income-related. So that's duality is the basis where the experiment was conducted. And as I will show a little bit later, is that the experiment or the experimental setting, it covered only those parts that are included in that basic security scheme in Finland, so that those benefits that were income related, they were left out from our models. And the reasons why we ended up with experimenting with the partial basic income was that in the very beginning, the government gave us 4 models to experiment with and evaluate how is it possible to experiment with those models. And we did lots of microsimulations and evaluated the feasibility of different models. First, we started with full basic income. And in that case, it had been something like 1,500 euros a month. And it had somehow replaced also some income-related benefits. But pretty soon, on the basis of our microsimulations, we realized that it's not feasible. It had been too expensive, so that the tax rate, if the basic income had been financed through taxes, the tax rate collected on money or income coming on top basic income had been something like 70–80% of the income, and it had been too much. And also because our experimental budget was rather limited, we had only 20 million euros in our experimental budget. In the case that the basic income had been that high, in that case, the number of people included in this study or experiment had been rather limited. And then we thought that, okay, it's not feasible to experiment with the full basic income. And then we evaluated also possibilities to carry out negative income tax, but that was not possible in that time because we didn't have income register that would be updated. But nowadays we have, from the beginning of 2019, there's an income register that's working on, perhaps not on daily basis, but almost, so that now it would be possible to have an experiment with negative income tax. And the present government that we have now, they will start, or actually they started already preparations to have some kind of negative income tax experiment and evaluations. But we had no that possibility. And then we evaluated some kind of participation income. What, for example, the British economist Anthony Atkinson has spoken about, that pretty soon we realized that we don't have capacities, bureaucratic capacities to screen what people are doing and which kind of activities they are carrying out and which kind of activities they are participating in and how much should be paid. if people are participating in this and that kind of activity. And then we said that, okay, we will not have that kind of experiment. And then in the end of the day, we had partial basic income that would be something like 500, 600 euros a month. And it would replace some basic benefits. And in the beginning, we had some ideas that it would be a nationwide experiment with municipal parts. And then there had been a nationwide randomization giving results from the whole country, and then a local experiment giving us possibilities to evaluate some kind of interaction effects at the local level. But because of legal constraints, monetary constraints, and time limits, we had to give up the kind of fancy ideas that we had in the very beginning. And the final setting that the government decided to have was that the basic income would be 560 euros a month. It's a net sum. And then we applied the present level of taxation on income exceeding that 560 euros. And in the case that the client who was selected to be included in the model and experimented, in the case that he or she had some other benefits that would be higher than 560 euros, in that case, the Social Insurance Institution of Finland would pay the difference between the present level and the 560 euros experimental level. And in the case that people would find employment, in that case, the work income would float on top of basic income. And what's unique in this experiment was that it was obligatory, so that we draw a random sampling from the registers of unemployed people that were registered in a social insurance institution. And we took 2,000 unemployed people from there, and the rest of the unemployed who were in our registers formed the control group. So that in the very beginning we had two groups, the treatment group getting basic income and control group that was totally identical with the treatment group. And as I said, that there was a nationwide randomization who were selected into the treatment group, and then they got information from the Social Insurance Institution that okay, that you will get basic income 560 euros, and you are included in the experiment for the next 2 years. And because it was an obligatory participation, we had to write legislation and plan the legislation for that. And that was rather time-consuming thing to somehow merge and somehow implement the basic income experiment in the existing social security system. That's rather complicated in the Finnish case. But anyway, we managed to do that, and the experiment started in the beginning of 2017. And it ran to the end of 2018. And the Social Insurance Institution paid out the benefit. And there was, in contrast to many other experiments that are voluntary, there's no selection bias in the Finnish experiment, and the dropouts, but the number of dropouts was rather limited. And the dropouts were of natural reasons, for example, deaths or something like that. The government wanted us to study if basic income is a good medicine to improve employment in this country. And that was the main outcome that we were interested in the experiment, or what the government was interested in. And if you look at the employment effects, and when the experiment started in the 2017, there were no difference whatsoever between the treatment group indicated by those black dots and the control group indicated by those circles. As you can see, there was no difference whatsoever here in the beginning. And the strength in the Finnish experiment is that we had identical treatment group and identical control group. And then we can draw rather strong causal consequences on the basis of that, so that if in the end of the experiment there are differences, we can say that it's caused by the treatment. And as you see here, during the first year, there were no differences, but then towards the year 2017, differences began to pop up, so that during the second year, there were almost significant differences between those two groups, in that sense that the treatment group had a higher level of employment. But nevertheless, the differences were not significant, statistically significant at the level of the treatment group and at the level of control group. But in some specific groups, among those people who have families, who had children and immigrants, differences were significant. And my interpretation is that those groups were younger, they were healthier, and they were closer to the labor market, so that it was easier for them to find employment on the basis of their basic income. And the interpretation of those results that are shown here is that those who are against basic income, they said that, okay, there you see, basic income is rubbish because it's not good for employment, because there are no significant employment results. And those proponents of basic income said that, okay, there you see, basic income is doing at least as well as the present social security system. And basic income is not making people lazier, and they are participating in the labor force and labor markets as much or even a little bit higher, more than those in the control group. So that the results gave something for each camp or the argumentation. Then the government wanted to know if basic income is good for abolishing bureaucracy, and also they were to some extent interested in well-being. The government as such was not that interested in well-being aspects, but when the experiment was discussed in the parliament, the parliamentary groups and parliamentary committees, especially the Committee for Social Affairs, said that we should study also not only bureaucracy and not only employment effects, but we should be also interested in more general well-being aspects. And therefore, we carried out surveys and we carried out interviews among the participants and among the control group people. And if we start with the bureaucracy effects, I have made some calculations on the basis of our survey, and you can see here that if we have experiences of bureaucracy, we ask that if you have had during the last 2 years too much bureaucracy when you have applied for social security. And in this regression model, to make long story short, the negative sign here means that, for example, treatment is reducing experiences of bureaucracy. And as you can see in all boxes, the effect or the correlation or the relationship is significant, and the significance remains even if the control for gender, age, education, health, and health is also very strongly correlated with the experiences bureaucracy, indicating that those people who have health conditions, they must wrestle with the social security bureaucracy much more than those people who don't have health conditions. But the main finding and the main story here is that the treatment, in the treatment group, those people had significantly less experiences of bureaucracy than people in the control group. And here is some information about trust. Trust is very important in very many senses, so that, for example, Francis Fukuyama has written extensively and published extensively books on the importance of trust. Not only is trust important for people, individuals, but it's important also for nations to prosper, as Fukuyama argues. And in the same way, Putnam has argued in favor of trust and said that the trust is one of the most important denominator of human well-being. And here, if you look at those columns, you can see that if you compare Finland with the rest of Europe, the rest of Europe is here in the left-hand column. And then we have all Finns here and all Finns experiencing unemployed and Finnish unemployed. And then we have here the treatment group and the experimental group, or the control group here. And the first story told on the basis of this table is that Finland is a high trust society. For example, the Finnish unemployed have higher trust in the legal system, police, the European Union, parliament, politicians, political parties, and other people than the average for the other European countries. And the same goes for the treatment group here, and also for the control group. And the red numbers here in the right-hand column indicate the differences, or the significant differences between the treatment group and the control group. And as you see, all those, almost all those differences are statistically very significant or significant. So that it seems to be so that getting basic income is positively associated with the higher level of trust, at least in the Finnish context. And the other aspect of well-being that we're interested in was linked to what Amartya Sen and Martin Nussbaum are speaking about when they are speaking about capabilities and confidence. And with measured confidence here, if people are confident with their own future, if they are confident in their own economic situation, and if they think that they have possibilities to cope in difficult life situations. And again, there, if you look at the right-hand column, and as regard confidence, there are significant differences there. That those people who were getting basic income, they are more confident with those different aspects that we carry data on. And then the Amartya Sen capability aspect, we ask if people think that they have capacities and capabilities to find a meaningful job, if they have possibilities to improve their material level of living, and if they somehow are masters in their own lives, and if they are somehow masters in society where they are living, if they have something to say in society they are living in. And against there, you can see that the capability is stronger and higher among those who are getting basic income. So that there's, I would argue that there's a kind of enhancing and capacity building aspects of getting unconditional basic income instead of conditional benefits. And it's also in the way that when we analyzed differences between trust in people and confidence and trust in the social security system, we found that those people who are getting basic income, they trusted much more in social security system, which then bifurcated higher trust in other people in society and higher trust in social institutions. And this picture is a little bit difficult. It's like transistor radio inside. It's a heuristic model of the possible association between those different things I have spoken. So that if you have here treatment and the outcome is confidence and capabilities, then treatment increases capabilities, that increases confidence, and treatment diminishes experiences of bureaucracy, and bureaucracy in turn decreases people's sense of capabilities. And as was said earlier, health has negative connotation or connection between bureaucracy, in that sense that those people with health issues, they have more bureaucratic problems, and the treatment decreases bureaucratic experiences. And then education is linked to health, financial problems, and both health and financing, or the financial resources are related to higher level of confidence, and also capabilities, of course, increase sense of confidence, so that if we think that we have capacities, in that case we are more confident in our own possibilities. So that this is somehow a heuristic model of those possible connections we have there between treatment and other aspects of our activities. Then finally, some words about the feasibility of the universal basic income in the post-COVID area in Finland. In very many other countries, the pandemic somehow launched a huge discussion of basic income. And the reason is that in very many other countries, not in Finland, they introduced lots of new novel schemes, social security schemes, in order to help people out and to protect people from the detrimental consequences of the pandemic. But that happened not in Finland that much. We had only some few very small adjustments in our social security system, and there were no major reforms caused by the pandemic. And the political perception seems to be so that the existing system works rather well also in rather exceptional circumstances, as the pandemic was. And therefore, the interpretation is that there's no need for the universal basic income. The existing social security system that is described here once again on the right-hand side of the panel works rather well, so that the comprehensive social security system and the comprehensive basic security system somehow buffered and worked against the most severe problems caused by the pandemic. And then, in conclusions, as regard the most important thing that the government was interested in, there was a small positive impact impact on the employment, but the problem is that in our experiment, because we only had unemployed people, we can't say anything about the substitution effect, meaning that what would have happened in the case that somebody had employment and then she or he had gotten 560 euros extra from basic income. Had that kind of people decrease the labor supply or not, so that we can't say anything about that. So that that's of course a problem in our experiment. And my interpretation is that the income transfers that give solid basic security, they are needed, but they should be combined with the social health and employment services. And that was a very clearly, that came out very clearly in our experiment, so that giving basic income doesn't make people younger. Basic income doesn't increase the years in education, but basic income would perhaps make them feel better. But in addition to that, they need combined services to help them back in the labor force, in the case that that's the main target. And basic income, according to our results, may decrease bureaucracy, so that there is a significant difference between the treatment group and the control group in terms of the experiences of bureaucracy. And also there's some kind of emancipatory aspect that the proponents of basic income are speaking about. And in our case, the level of trust, confidence, and feelings of dignity that I'm somebody, they're much higher among the treatment group than among the controls. And nevertheless, my conclusion is a little bit sad for the proponents of the basic income, that despite those positive findings and positive results, the COVID pandemic somehow killed the discussion of basic income in Finland, and the discussion just now is more or less about something else than about basic income. And then in the case that you are interested to see something more and to learn something more about the Finnish basic income experiment, there's that book that Nick already advertised. And the book is also available online, so that you don't need to buy it if you don't want. And there's much more about the experiment, why it was started, how it was started, how it was planned, and why it was like it was, and which kind of results we got. And there's much richer description what the experiment was about and what the results were than I was able to give in this short presentation. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer questions in the case that you have any.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Ollie. Thanks very much indeed, Ollie. That's fantastic. While we wait for our colleague Jetta to feed through any questions from people watching from YouTube, I've got a few questions I'd like to start with, if I may. The first is, your pilot was a national pilot. It took place with the treatment group and the control group were national across Finland as a whole. A lot of interest in basic income and interest in doing experiments and pilots comes from the local level and the sub-national level. So as you know, Ollie, in the UK we have interest in Scotland and Wales, for example, in piloting basic income. And one of the questions that arises in those local and national contexts are, how can you best do a pilot at an area basis? So you take a whole population, but at a local area-wide population selection. And I'm wondering whether that was something you considered in the case in Finland, or whether there were problems with the tax system or constitutional issues that prevented you taking a locally defined area-wide population.
Yes, thank you. That's a very important question. And somehow differences between those people who are advocating nationwide randomized experiments and those who are in favor of local experiments, and those who are in favor of local experiments, they are calling us randomistas. And I would say that I'm not a randomista in that sense that we planned, when we started planning the experiment, so that we will have a nationwide randomized experiment in order to somehow safeguard that whatever happens in this or that municipality, in that case, we will get some results that are not contaminated by those things that would happen in the municipality. That, for example, in the state or experiments that they had in the States in the 70s, 80s, sometimes they were contaminated and destroyed because of external or internal shocks that took place in those experimental settings. So that if you had one municipality and suddenly a big employer stops there and there's a boom of unemployed, then we can say that if it's caused by the treatment, or if some enterprise starts a new site in that municipality and then unemployment goes down, once again we have a problem. So that as I said, that we had that kind of deliberations, and then the first plan that we presented to the government, we had two parts: the nationwide randomization and then a couple of municipalities. Either the total population or a huge number, something like 70% of the population would have had basic income. And then we, in those saturated municipalities, we could have inspected those interaction and community effects, what we couldn't do here. And one problem in having that kind of extensive municipal experiment in this country is that the municipalities have the rights to collect taxes. And then we presented those plans to have a very extensive municipal experiment. Then the representatives of the municipalities said that no way, that we will lose our money, because basic income is paid tax-free, and in that case we will lose our revenues. So that there was that kind of resistance. And also in the very end there was a legal problem, and there were also monetary problems, in that sense that the budget that we had was too small. And when we asked government that they would, or we would need some extra money, something like 70 millions, they said that no way, so that you must be satisfied with that 20 millions.
So you had a hard budget constraint, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And also those legal constraints that we were wrestling with.
Yeah.
And those problems are, I think that they were well described in the book, so that there were lots of constraints. And when planning that kind of experiments, we, as Jürgen Wiespeler says, that the planning experiment is an art of compromises. And I don't know how much we were artists, but we were compelled to do lots of compromises, so that we had a high expectations, but then from the heavens, we came very soon down to the ashes with our experimentation.
Yeah. That's a very good way of putting it. Can I just ask on the substantive points about the employment effects? You talked in your presentation about there being significant employment outcomes for immigrants and people with families, which you hypothesized was, or you inferred was because they were younger, healthier, and closer to the labor market. And I suppose one conclusion you could draw from that might be that another version of a partial basic income might be one that was available to young people, which might be more affordable and might be something that had more chances of being politically realized. In the case, for example, in Wales, the government there is going to introduce a basic income only for people leaving local authority care, young people who are care leavers. So a very, very small population, but nonetheless focusing on young people. And I just wonder whether your conclusions about cost and political feasibility of basic income might be different if we took smaller defined populations and gave them an entitlement to a basic income. And then we might see, some very positive effects because of this proximity to the labor market and so on.
Yeah, probably and possibly. And what happened when we were planning the experiment, the Minister and Ministry of Education was interested also to have a specific experiment with the students.
Right.
In this country, we have free study grant, so that it's granted by the state, but it's income test, so that in the case that the student will get employment and will get a certain income above a certain level, in that case, the student will lose the study allowance. And the minister, she wanted me to somehow sketch a model how to experiment with students. And the idea was, what I proposed to her was that, okay, let's take away that limit, so that it's a kind of basic income for students, so that it had been a very easy way of having that kind of testing to see what will happen. But somehow, I don't know why, in the final end, the ministry or the minister didn't act or react on that, so that we did some microsimulations, and I had, to my mind, a rather feasible experimental setting for the specific group, so that it had been an answer to that question of yours.
Yeah. Yes.
But unfortunately not. I don't know why. I must perhaps ask what was the reason that they didn't react on that.
That'd be very interesting. The other area I wanted to ask you about, Ollie, was your concluding slide about the effects of the pandemic. That, in contrast to other countries, the pandemic had not produced a sort of upsurge in debate about basic income. And you argued that was because the social security system seemed to work well during the pandemic, and therefore seemed to be fit for purpose, and a basic income not being needed, as perhaps you might argue would be the case in countries with underdeveloped welfare states, or places like the United States where cash transfers were made to whole populations and so on. And I think one of the reasons why people have argued that social security isn't working as well in advanced welfare states is because it hasn't kept up with the gig economy, casualized labor contracts, and the rise in self-employment. And I'm wondering, how did your welfare state in Finland then deal with people in those circumstances? Or do you simply regulate your labor market in such a way that you don't have people in the equivalent of what we in the UK would call the gig economy, or mini jobs in Germany, or casualized labor elsewhere. What is the answer to that?
Actually, there is no silver bullet neither in this country, so that the gig economy, I think it will cause problems, not in that sense that it will be the end of labor or paid labor, that it will change the mode of labor contracts, so that those employment contracts that we used to have during the industrial era, they are somehow not diminishing, but vanishing, but they are diminishing, and there are more and more people in gig economy jobs. And the question is that if that social security that we constructed during the industrial era, if those social security models fit in the present system. And we have here in this country, like in many other countries, they have problems in that sense that the old social security system doesn't recognize those new modes of employment. For example, those who are driving Uber cars or who are delivering food, if they are employees or if they are self-employed or what they are, and who should take responsibility for their social security. So that in Finland, we have rather good social security, I would argue, for the traditional employees. And to some extent also not that good as for employees, but rather good security for self-employed. But if you are not employee or clear-cut self-employed, in that case you fall through, and that's the problem.
But that didn't give rise to sort of demands for basic income in the same way then in Finland. You just didn't have the same.
No, for some reason it has not generated that discussion that much.
Did you say at the beginning of your talk that there was, however, interest in trialing a negative income tax scheme? Is that right?
Yeah, and the government that started that old experiment that I was speaking about, it was center-right government, and we have now a social democratic or left-leaning government, and they said that they will start experimentation with negative income tax. But in the English-speaking version of the governmental program, they say that they will start a new experiment with basic income, so that it's lost in translation, perhaps. But unfortunately enough, that the pandemic came, and then the whole inertia that the government had and the possibilities they had, the pandemic took all the steam from the government. But now they said that, okay, they will start experimenting with something, and that something is a negative income tax.
Yeah.
But I don't know, it's much more or much smaller experiment than this experiment that we had, and probably it will be done on a virtual basis, so that they will have some microsimulations or that kind of things, and then they say that that was the experiment.
Oh, I see. So it'd just be a desk exercise, right? Okay.
Yeah. And perhaps some kind of extra paycheck for those who are employed, or some money that we can keep in the case that they get employment. In the case that, for example, they are unemployed, so that, for example, just now during the pandemic, they increased the exempt amount, meaning that a person could earn 500 euros a month. And after that, there was a tapering or cuts in the benefit, so that it was a kind of 500 euros basic income there on bottom. Yeah. I think that they will have that kind of exercise that doesn't need that kind of experimental setting as we planned.
Yes, yes, I understood. Yes, it's equivalent to, I mean, we have a work allowance in the university.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah,
so that it would be something like that.
Yeah, I understand. I suppose people watching this will think it's sort of curious that a centre-right government took forward a pilot for basic income, and then you've got a left-leaning social democratic government talking about a negative income tax, and usually you reverse that. You'd have a right-wing government talking about negative income tax, Milton Friedman and all that, and you'd have a left-wing government perhaps talking about basic income or basic services and basic income, and some combination of those. And I suppose it would just be interesting to hear your reflections, and I know it's in the book, and I've heard you talk about it before, but the politics of establishing the pilot, and then the sort of politics of not sort of rolling it out further despite the positive results.
Yeah, that the political process is a rather tricky and interesting thing, and I had the possibility to peep in the dark chambers of political decision making, in that sense that to see what's the role of politicians and what's the role of bureaucrats, and how the bureaucracy is somehow filtering ideas coming, which kind of ideas they are then transmitting to the politicians or to minister, so that the bureaucrats in the ministry, they are somehow a filter between ideas and the political decision making. But it was interesting, and also in our case, we had 3 ministers who were involved in the planning process. First, there was a Minister of Social Affairs. She was from the True Finns. And in the very beginning, she was a little bit afraid that the basic income experiment will improve the image of the country very much, that it will be too lucrative for people outside Finland, and they will come Finland. And then we had a Minister of Community, and she was responsible for all experiments. And Minister of Social Affairs was responsible for this specific experiment, and they had different views. And then we had a Minister of Finance who was against all experiments, and he said that it's rubbish. And I was in the middle of this triangle or evil or good, good things. It was a kind of sarcasm.
Yeah.
The ideas are disappearing like ships.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm just seeing whether we've got any questions come through the chat. I don't know if people are watching this, whether they do want to send one in. We've got a bit of time, so please do. If not, I'll just ask Ollie a couple more questions and then we'll wrap up. But if you've got any questions, do bung them in now, because then we can address them directly to Ollie. I wanted just to I suppose, further question on the political one, Ollie, is this question of vested interests in existing welfare states, particularly the kind of dual welfare states where you've got insiders with contribution-based benefits, earnings-related benefits, trade unions and employers structured into those welfare states, and outsiders who are less well covered by those welfare states. You talked earlier about industrial welfare states. And just whether the kind of political feasibility then of things like basic income may be higher in countries that have, like the UK, perhaps more flat rate, basic, very limited contribution basis, a welfare state that's been around a long time, but a liberal Beveridgean one that doesn't offer more than relatively limited flat rate and means tested benefits. Or indeed in countries, developing countries that still don't have developed welfare states, whether they may be more, as it were, fertile soil for people advocating for basic income than the developed welfare states of the Nordic countries or the continental Bismarckian welfare states.
Yeah, I would say so. So that, for example, the interest in the experiment has not been that huge, for example, in our neighboring countries, Sweden and Norway, And I have been there a couple of times and spoken about the experiment and results, but they are saying that the whole idea of basic income is rubbish, and it's not suitable for the Scandinavian model. And I think that you are totally right in that sense that it would be easier, for example, in Finland to implement basic income in the case that we didn't have those income-related benefits. And there's a vested interest in that sense in those income-related benefits that, for example, our income-related unemployment benefits, they are run by voluntary unemployment funds. And usually those funds are administrated by trade unions. And there's an incentive for people to join the fund, and very often they join the trade union, and the trade union density in Finland, it's perhaps it's the highest in the world. And actually we have two other countries that have in Europe that have that voluntary system, Denmark and Sweden. And in both in those three countries we have union density something hovering around 70%.
Yes.
And those unemployment funds see basic income as a threat. Because if we had full basic income, in that case, there's no point whatsoever, at least for middle income and low income people, to join those funds. And also the trade unions are a little bit afraid that if we have basic income, in that case, their role in society would be much lower. And in a similar way, employment-related pensions in this country, they are run by the representatives of trade unions and employer federation. And also in that case, because the average pension in Finland is something like 1,500 euros. If basic income had been 1,000 or 1,500 euros, in that case, those employment-related pensions had become redundant and obsolete for those people who are in low-income positions or middle-income positions also in this country. So that there was a resistance both from the organized employment-related pension system and then from the unemployment fund system and from trade unions.
Yeah.
And interesting enough, those stronger male-dominated, export-oriented trade unions were much more against basic income than those service-based, female-dominated trade unions that, for example, are in retail sector or in restaurant business.
Yeah. Exactly. So the service occupations, absolutely. Yeah. I have got a question actually from the audience, Ollie, which is one I wanted to ask you myself. Actually, I've forgotten to raise this, but one of the big drivers of interest in basic income in the UK, amongst activists and others, is the welfare state and access to social security, now universal credit, is heavily conditional. Sanctions which have been applied, very extensively, people withdrawing from the benefit system because they don't want to be involved in that kind of conditionality regime, or finding that their benefits are removed and they're subject to sanctions. And when the pandemic struck in the UK, that conditionality had to be stopped because there weren't face-to-face services. You couldn't go to the job centre. It wasn't possible to implement those kinds of regimes anymore. And the question is, what happened in Finland? Did you have any changes to your active labour market or conditionality regimes for social assistance?
Yes, to some extent. So that in the present system, for example, in labour markets, subsidy and basic unemployment compensation and income-related unemployment benefits, there are conditions in that sense that you have to contact labour market offices and to somehow show that you are active. Those conditions were released to some extent also in this country. And those contacts were carried out online very often. So that those contacts are usually done in every third month. So that there are 3 months in between those contacts, but they were done now online, if they were done. So that it was, I think that it was pretty much the same as in the UK, so that those conditionalities were released, at least to some extent.
Yeah, yeah. So in effect, people on social assistance, unemployment benefits were receiving that income unconditionally for the pandemic period.
Yeah.
Of course, we can't study the employment effects of that because it's such an exceptional period in the labour market. But that in itself, of course, is an interesting question about how far experiments with basic income might just be thought of as experiments with going back to systems of social security that are less conditional, that have fewer conditions applied to recipients.
Yeah, there may be some comparative possibilities to compare different countries, how unconditional benefits were paid out this country in comparison with that country that that had more conditionals.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think if we haven't, I'm just going to check the chat now. I think if we haven't got any further questions, I'm going to say thank you very much, Professor Kangas, for speaking to us today. And I hope all of you who've been listening into this session have enjoyed, the sort of deep dive and detail about the Finland experiment. And Professor Kangas, put that link on his slide. I'll just show you again. It's the Edward Elgar book. It's got a lot of great detail in it. As I say, including lots of these political questions as well, that it isn't just about the outcomes from the evaluation. It's also about how it was set up, the politics of establishing the pilot, and then the politics of the sort of feasibility of basic income, as Professor Kangas discussed it towards the end of his talk there. So really worth reading if you're a researcher or an activist or interested in basic income at all. It's a really important book about what happened in Finland. So Professor Kangas, thank you very much indeed. It's great to see you again. And thank you,
my pleasure.
Thank you for joining our conference today, and we'll keep in touch with the work. And the microsimulation group for the FRIBIS group that we're working on will start to publish papers in the coming months. So also for those of you interested in microsimulation of basic income schemes, keep an eye out for our bit of the FRIBIS, the Freiburg Institute for Basic Income Studies website, and you'll find those things there. So thanks very much indeed. Thank you, Professor Kangas. Thank you all for watching, and I'll leave you now. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that presentation and that nice conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess.